Hey everybody. Today I want to talk about the concept of perpetration and perpetuation. Perpetration, obviously, to do something to someone else. Perpetuation, to allow something to continue. And I want to talk about it in the context of exploitation. So I was thinking about this tweet I saw a couple months ago from a person who works in a prison. And they said, all of my prisoners, from the most docile white collar crime or minor drug crime people to the most violent prisoners. Every single one of them in this prison has experienced violence, and none of them, their first experience of violence was as a perpetrator. So all of these people, many of them very violent people, many of them people who've definitely lost the path, they were never just like woke up one day and decided to be violent. Their story, all of their stories were that someone had been violent towards them, and as a result of that violence, things spun out of control. And when I was younger, I used to hear stories like this, and people would frequently interpret them, or I would interpret them as meaning that if you were a victim of violence, if something bad had happened to you as a child or in your childhood, that it basically guaranteed that you would also continue to be bad. I mean, one of the things that kept me from talking about or acknowledging my own childhood violence was the concept that if I admitted that I had been the victim of violence and other exploitation in my childhood, that would mean that I would automatically be more likely or guaranteed, fated to become violent or cruel myself. And that's also not true. Almost 100% of perpetrators were victims at one point in time. Not 100% of people who were victims become perpetrators. And in fact, the number of us who have experienced something traumatic in our lives that don't go on to perpetuate that trauma is a number that we can't rightly know because of the stigma against survivors. And that's one of the things I want to talk about, why I want to talk about perpetuation and perpetration. So many of us, not just people of color, but I'm mostly talking to people like me, people who've worked our way up from a less advantaged situation, from a more exploitable population. A lot of us were exploited early on in our careers or continue to be exploited today. Many of us, because of our gender, our sexual identity, our race, our background, our immigration status, are not paid the same as our colleagues that have more privilege and access to privilege. That means that we are perpetuating exploitation. When we allow ourselves to be exploited by a system that doesn't see our value, even if that's what we must do to survive, I'm not saying that I have any kind of judgment against people who are in positions they feel trapped in. That is real. I've been there. It sucks. But, and, rather than but, I want to say and, we must accept and acknowledge that when we allow ourselves to be exploited, we also allow people like us to be exploited. And when we allow ourselves to be exploited in a place where we have a position of power, we perpetuate that exploitation. I mean, we perpetuate exploitation by allowing ourselves to be exploited, but if we have an inch of power, and we lean in to being exploited, we lean in to being the person who's always going to go the extra mile. I'm not saying going the extra mile is wrong. I am saying that let's look at who goes the extra mile. Let's look at who's expected to go the extra mile. Let's look at who gets punished for not going the extra mile in our systems, in our communities. Is it non-men? Is it women? Is it people of color? Is it people who have a lower title than us? Because if that's the system that we're in, we're perpetuating exploitation. We're perpetuating inequality, and we're perpetuating inequity. And that is going to make it so that we are not in a good market position to profit off of the people we've convinced to come and work for us and with us. Because if we spend our time and our labor and our emotional energy making sure that it continues to be easy to exploit people like us, then we will not be spending our time and energy and our labor doing the brave thing to stop the cycle, to say, hey, I was exploited early in my career. I've been exploited in other situations, and I'm not going to let that continue. Not just because it's the right thing to do. I say this a lot, but it's true. It's not just the right thing to do, it's also the profitable thing to do. When you are spending money keeping people down, keeping them small, making it so that they think that their only value is their ability to capitalize on their labor and go the extra mile for no extra reward, when you make people think that and you put them in that place, they're spending a lot of time defending their self-worth, defending their right to access to opportunity, and they're not spending a lot of time being expansive, thinking of creative solutions and innovating. So, in order to invest in the human capital that you are so blessed to have access to, it's time to examine your own exploitation. It's time to examine the times that you knew you had to work harder than colleagues who had more privilege than you. And it's time to stop the cycle with you. And that is going to mean an inward journey that business books don't usually talk about, that they don't tell us about. If you want to look at that inward journey more closely, I recommend looking at Brene Brown's work. I also recommend a book called Difficult Conversations. I think it's called Difficult Conversations. I'll put a link in the comments about it. But that's my thought of the day, just perpetuation and perpetration, because a lot of us think that because we didn't become perpetrators of exploitation, we pat ourselves on the back. And that's good. That's better than being a perpetrator. But if we're not actively working against exploiting our younger, less privileged, lower on the org chart workers, if not, we're not actively empowering the people beneath us in an organization, then we are perpetuating their exploitation. And that's a thing we have to come to terms with, accept, and deal with. I have and continue to do that work on myself. It is hard because I have to look at myself and I have to understand that there were times that I could have made someone's journey easier and I made it harder instead. And that sucks. And also, that pain teaches me how I hurt that person or those people and why I don't want to do it again. Why I would rather deal with the pain of being brave and stopping the cycle than the pain of hurting someone else and knowing that I hurt someone else when I didn't have to, or when I had the power to not do that. So that's my thought today. I will link those books that I talked about in the downstairs. Also, I love to talk about perpetuation and perpetration and how we're stopping the cycle of exploitation in our organizations today. See you tomorrow.